Hey everyone, so as most people who are active in the One Piece community know, a lot of people feel as though the series has not been quite as good since the time skip. I'm not going to get into the why people feel the series has declined and what has arguably changed. I think that's a separate video on its own. Here I just want to add something to the discussion, something that I feel is extremely fundamentally important to consider when making the comparison between pre and post time skip. And it's something that I never see acknowledged or even really talked about. So what I'm talking about is story structure. When people ask me what my favorite thing about One Piece is, it's actually not the characters or the world building or any of that, although I love all that stuff as well. For me, it's actually the story structure, and as I see it, there's been a massive shift in One Piece's story structure from pre to post time skip. And because of this massive shift in story structure, from my perspective, we're not yet at a point where we can fairly compare post time skip to pre-time skip. In fact, we've not yet even completed the first post-time skip storyline. I know that sounds weird, like we're 300 chapters into post-time skip and I'm saying we haven't completed one full storyline yet, but that's true. So to explain what I mean, let's go back to the basics on how One Piece's story structure works. So, there are arcs, and then there are sagas. Sagas are composed of multiple arcs. For example, Jaya is an arc. Skypiea is an arc. Put those two arcs together and you have a saga. So the full Skypiea saga is the complete storyline that started with the ship falling from the sky that led the Straw Hats to Jaya, and then ended with the Straw Hats' own ship coming down from the sky as they left Skypiea. If you've never really thought about arcs and sagas before, I suggest going over to the One Piece Wiki, which has a nice fan-made breakdown of what most of the community views as arcs and sagas. And I think I've read somewhere that the official One Piece site has some differences in their breakdown, like I think Thriller Bark is somehow part of the overall Marineford saga. I'm not sure, doesn't really matter, point is the same. Arcs make up sagas, and a saga is a complete storyline. By the end of a saga, the primary plotline that they started with has closed. So, like, plan to save Alabasta starts, plan is accomplished. Trouble with Nico Robin starts, trouble is resolved, that sort of thing. Now, we didn't always have this structure. This structure only really formed when the story moved from East Blue to the Grand Line. Back in East Blue, everything was very, very, very self-contained. Each island was basically an isolated storyline. There wasn't a defining plot thread that was building up over multiple arcs. Like, yes, we had the vague goal of, get more crew members and get to the Grand Line, but that's about it. There was very little plot that carried over from Shellstown to Orangetown to Syrup Village, etc. It was very much a villain of the week format as well, like just running through brand new pirate bosses each island without any sort of, overarching big bad the entire time. The only time a plotline really carried over was when, Nami left during Barati, but that's about it. Even though East Blue arcs have been retroactively grouped together and dubbed a saga today, East Blue was nothing like the later saga since it was mostly just a collection of isolated story arcs. It was only when we shifted to the Grand Line that the storytelling changed. The adventure got bigger, and so the storytelling got more ambitious. It started with Oda setting a goal that was much greater than anything we'd had before, defeating the Warlord of the Sea, Crocodile, which sets us on an unprecedentedly large plotline that could not be completed in just one arc. So, here, Oda actually started linking his story arcs together to create a larger narrative. Like the Baroque work Saga started with setting a very concrete goal in Whiskey Peak, and from then on, for the first time, we had a very definitive, overarching plot thread that carried over the next few arcs, and that whole narrative only completed when that plot thread resolved. So that was the first big shift in One Piece storytelling, from East Blue to the Grand Line. We shifted from isolated arcs to real, complete sagas. So here is the big difference between pre-time skip and post-time skip storytelling that people don't talk about when making comparisons. We have actually had a similar shift in storytelling from the Grand Line to the New World, because again, the adventure got bigger, and so the storytelling has gotten more ambitious. It started with Oda setting a goal that was much greater than anything before, defeating an Emperor of the Seas, Kaido, which basically set us on an absolutely massive, unprecedented plotline that will not be completed in one arc or even one saga. This has actually become our first multi-saga storyline. So now instead of just arcs and sagas, we have, basically you could call it like a super saga. If a saga is one complete storyline composed of multiple arcs, then a super saga is one gigantic complete storyline composed of multiple sagas. Because think about it, Punk Hazard and Dressrosa made up the Dressrosa saga, and then Zoe, Whole Cake Island, Reverie, and Wano are making up the Versus 4 Emperors saga. But really, all of that has actually been part of the same storyline that started with the same goal. It's just a much, much bigger storyline than anything we've had before. This is essentially a super saga made up of both the Dressrosa saga and the current saga. And that's not me just making shit up, like this gigantic continuous storyline has been very clearly illustrated for us by Oda. Literally everything from Punk Hazard onwards has been one continuous storyline to defeat Kaido. And in chapter 920 we even get some nice visual recap of how this gigantic conflict that we now have is something that has been built over multiple arcs and sagas, and all of these were just micro storylines leading towards this climax. And I'll add that if Big Mom is defeated in this arc along with Kaido, which I personally have felt the story has been building towards for a long time, then really the Fishman Island saga that started the Big Mom conflict would be part of this giant super saga as well, meaning that literally every saga so far since the time skip has been leading to this gigantic climax in the Wano arc. So that's the key difference that people need to keep in mind, that, okay, we're working with a much bigger storyline than ever before, and we're actually only just now reaching the main section of it. Now, why does that matter so much in the pre-time skip versus post-time skip debate, and why does it make comparisons, in my opinion, unfair at the moment so far? Because all we've had in the New World so far are build-up storylines, and build-up storylines are naturally not going to reach the dramatic highs of something like the Enies Lobby or the Marineford saga. You wouldn't even expect them to. It's an apples to oranges comparison. Comparison only makes sense once we get through the climax of this whole storyline to defeat Kaido, and then we can judge this entire narrative as a whole. If you don't think that makes sense, then again, go back to the East Blue to Grand Line comparison. That was the first time the story structure shifted from standalone storylines to more build-up storylines to create a bigger narrative, and most importantly, a bigger payoff. If you look at each of those arcs of the Baroque Works saga leading up to Alabasta, and compare them individually to the East Blue arcs, guess what? A lot of them don't compare that well in isolation. I guarantee that if those chapters were coming out today, people will be talking about how the Grand Line was overhyped and how it's been disappointing compared to East Blue. Like, Reverse Mountain was just an arc about a whale. Whiskey Peak and Little Garden make Baroque Works look kind of weak compared to East Blue villains. Drum Kingdom has a nice backstory for Chopper, but where are the high stakes? Where's the intensity? Where's the emotional investment from the Straw Hats? Where are the moments like Help Me, or Zoro vs. Mihawk and Zoro's Oath, or Luffy on the execution stand? Why isn't everyone getting a 1v1 every arc? Why is only Luffy getting all the fights? Does any of that sound familiar to what people are saying today? I want you to think about that, because guess what? Despite all of that, ultimately the Alabasta arc turned out to be better than any of the East Blue arcs, at least in the opinion of most readers today. Not only that, the Baroque Works saga as a whole is generally considered to be better than the East Blue saga by most readers today, despite the build-up arcs not being as strong in isolation. Why? Because the payoff was worth it in the end. That's the key. Even if a lot of the individual arcs that made up the Baroque Works saga weren't quite on par with the East Blue arcs on their own, the climax of the Alabasta arc made this whole Baroque Works narrative better than the East Blue narrative, and that climax was so good only because it had been built up by all those other arcs. So you see what I'm getting at? Like, there's a big difference between storylines that are complete narratives themselves versus storylines that are building towards a conclusion to a larger storyline. Obviously, even in build-up storylines, you still expect action, emotion, drama, their own story and climax and all that, but you have to understand that these storylines are ultimately meant to build to a future arc where all that will be ramped up to 11. So, to take some of the New World criticism, for example, a common comparison is Alabasta versus Dressrosa. In isolation, sure, I could say that I personally like the Alabasta arc as an arc better than Dressrosa as an arc. But that doesn't prove pre-time skip One Piece is better than post-time skip One Piece, because it's not a one-to-one comparison. The Dressrosa arc is not actually a climax to a complete storyline, whereas the Alabasta arc is. That's why it was emphasized over and over and over that Doflamingo is the sub-boss. He's not the big boss, that this is not the big mission, this is a preliminary mission. And unlike Alabasta, Dressrosa had to set up a lot more plot points for the actual climactic arc of the larger narrative later down the line, which meant that we only had story space for half the crew, everyone besides Luffy didn't really get serious all-out fights, and there wasn't as much high-stakes personal investment for each of the Straw Hats. So at the end of the day, Dressrosa was a really good standalone storyline in my opinion, with some great moments, but it wasn't a maximum payoff arc because that's not what that beat of the story warranted. It's not the climax of the narrative. It was definitely a dramatic halfway note in the narrative, but it wasn't really the crescendo that everything is building towards. I wouldn't expect to see all the Straw Hats, in this state at the end of Dressrosa, like they were at the end of Alabasta, because that's just not the point the narrative was at. And all of that applies to Punk Hazard and Whole Cake Island as well. So, all of that being said, bottom line is that we have to be aware that the story structure has changed, that we have not yet actually completed the first major storyline of the New World. And so to me, it doesn't really make sense to make comparisons to complete storylines from pre-Timeskip. Basically, we won't really have a clear evaluation of how good this first gigantic storyline of the New World has been until Wano ends, because Wano is the payoff arc. The way Alabasta was the climax to the first Grand Line saga, that's what Wano is to the first New World Super Saga. And just like Alabasta had way more build-up than ever before, Wano has basically scaled that to the next level up. And that's why it's interesting to me, like a lot of people talk about how, Oda has been overhyping Wano in interviews, and how editors have overhyped Wano, and how he shouldn't say things like, oh, Wano is going to make Marineford look like nothing. You have to understand that looking at the amount of in-story setup that Oda has done for this arc, and how in terms of narrative structure, this is a conclusion to a storyline on a completely different scale than anything he has done so far. Yes, by all means, in terms of size and vision, it should completely blow Marineford out of the water. And a while back I made a video on why Wano will be 200 chapters. And a lot of people just couldn't understand that because, no other arc has been that long. But I think most people don't fully realize that this is the conclusion to the first super saga of One Piece. It's not just a normal saga. Previous standards don't apply because this is something completely new. Again, a simple comparison would be how Alabasta, at 60 chapters, was more than twice the size of any individual arc before it. Unprecedented at the time, but fitting for the conclusion to the first actual saga of One Piece. Now, all that being said, here's the big caveat. Size, scale, and vision doesn't mean quality. Is Wano going to be as good as it's supposed to be? Because I'm not trying to say that we should just praise everything post-Timeskip because it's all build up to the biggest arc ever. I'm just saying we can't really evaluate all this till we see the whole story for what it is at the end of Wano, and then we can decide if the payoff was worth it. In my opinion, we've only just gotten to the actual meat of the story, so it's hard to evaluate the arc just yet, but I do think the payoff has to be worth it. Remember, with Alabasta, yes, it took several arcs of build-up, but at the end of the Alabasta arc, most readers were like, yes, that was worth it. That whole storyline took One Piece to another level from East Blue. To me personally, the fact that Wano hasn't just been several arcs of build-up, but actually multiple sagas and literally hundreds and hundreds of chapters means it should be better than anything pre-Timeskip. It should be, but of course that doesn't mean it will be. So I hope that at the end of this, I can feel that yes, this was a storyline that was bigger and grander than anything Oda could have done with the shorter structures of pre-Timeskip storylines. Whether that actually is the case in the end, we'll have to wait and see. Though I have to say I have personally enjoyed the setup phase of Wano so far. Personally, again, I think we'll be waiting a long time before we can make our evaluation at the end of Wano because, as I said before, I believe it will be at least 200 chapters long. So, if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, share, and subscribe, and check out my Patreon for chapter reviews and Extended Thoughts podcast.